My name is Diego, and I was there when Claire's story changed forever. On March 15, 2024, outside the courthouse steps worth $2.3 million in divorce settlements, she stood facing her ex-husband with her heart pounding like thunder against her ribs. She smiled through gritted teeth as the judge's final words echoed in her mind. The same man who had staged his own funeral just 2 years ago to escape his debts was now forced to hand over everything he'd tried so desperately to hide. The sweet smell of fresh grass from the courthouse lawn mixed with the gentle melody of wind chimes from a nearby cafe, creating an almost peaceful atmosphere that betrayed the storm of emotions raging inside her. The scent should have been calming, but instead it amplified her sense of betrayal, making every breath feel like swallowing broken glass. How could she have mourned at his staged funeral, sobbing over an empty casket while he watched from the shadows? The soft, tinkling sounds that once might have soothed her now felt like mockery. She smiled but trembled, her hands shaking as she clutched the settlement papers. How can blood turn to poison like this? What nobody knew was that Claire had discovered something 3 days earlier that would turn this victory into the beginning of her worst nightmare. Hidden in her ex-husband's old jacket, she'd found a letter that revealed the real reason behind their divorce, and it had nothing to do with what everyone believed. The fake funeral had been just the beginning of his deception. The morning coffee had grown cold on the kitchen counter, its rich aroma mixing with the scent of rosemary drifting through the open window. Claire stood at the sink, watching droplets of water fall from her fingertips onto the ceramic mug David had painted for her last Christmas, before the diagnosis, before everything changed. The wind chimes on the porch played their gentle melody, a sound that once brought her comfort but now only emphasized the silence where his laughter used to be. 3 weeks had passed since the funeral, and she was finally ready to tackle the attic. David's belongings couldn't stay scattered forever, though part of her wanted to leave everything exactly as he'd arranged it. She climbed the creaky wooden steps, each groan of the floorboards echoing through the empty house like a reminder of all the conversations they'd never have. Sunlight filtered through the small attic window, illuminating dust motes that danced in the stale air. David's wooden chest sat in the corner, the one his grandfather had made decades ago. She'd seen him lock it carefully during his final weeks, his hands trembling from the chemotherapy, but his determination unwavering. The key hung on his old keychain, still carrying the faint scent of his cologne. Claire's fingers shook as she turned the lock, the mechanism clicking open with surprising ease. Inside, family photos lay carefully arranged. Their wedding day, holidays, quiet Sunday mornings on the porch. But underneath the memories sat something unexpected, his old cassette recorder, the one from college that he'd claimed was broken years ago. "Oh my God," she whispered, lifting the device with careful hands. "I can't believe this still works." A cassette tape sat inside, unmarked except for her name written in David's careful handwriting across the label. Claire's heart sank as she realized he'd been planning this moment long before she was ready to face it. The weight of the recorder felt heavier than it should, loaded with words she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. She carried it downstairs to the kitchen, settling into David's chair at the breakfast table, where they'd shared thousands of meals. The scent of barbecue smoke drifted from a neighbor's yard. Preserve the original language of the texts they'd hosted, back when David could still stand at the grill without exhaustion overwhelming him. Her finger hovered over the play button. David had been so secretive those final weeks, having hushed phone conversations and locking away papers she'd never seen. She'd assumed it was just his way of maintaining some control over a situation that had spiraled beyond anyone's grasp. That assumption felt naive now, sitting in their empty kitchen with his final secret in her hands. The tape began with the familiar hiss of old technology, followed by David's voice, stronger than it had been in months, suggesting he'd recorded this early in his illness. "Claire, my love, if you're hearing this, then you found my insurance policy." His words sent chills down her spine. Insurance policy? They'd gone over all their paperwork together, or so she'd thought. David's voice continued, steady and purposeful in a way that made her lean closer to the small speaker. "I know what's coming, and I know who's going to come out of the woodwork when I'm gone. Stephanie called last week, first time in 3 years, asking about my affairs. Derek's been sniffing around too, suddenly interested in family dinners after ignoring us through the worst of the treatments." Claire's hands gripped the recorder tighter. Stephanie, David's ex-wife, had indeed called recently, offering hollow condolences and asking pointed questions about David's business. Derek, David's brother, had shown up at the funeral with legal papers and a sudden concern for family assets that felt calculated rather than genuine. "I've been preparing for this, Claire. Everything you need to know about what I've really left behind and what I've hidden from everyone else is in this recording. But first, you need to understand something about the night Stephanie left me during my first cancer scare." The tape continued, but David's next words made Claire's blood run cold. Because what he revealed about that night 5 years ago wasn't the story he told her, wasn't the story anyone knew. It was the story of a woman who hadn't just abandoned her sick husband. She'd stolen something valuable when she left, something David had spent years planning to reclaim. "The painting," David's voice crackled through the old speaker. "My grandfather's original watercolor of the lighthouse, the one worth $40,000 that I inherited from Mom. Stephanie knew exactly what she was taking when she cleaned out the study that night." Claire pressed pause, her mind reeling. She remembered that painting hanging in their first apartment, how David had stared at it for hours after Stephanie left. He'd told her it had been damaged in the move, that he'd had to throw it away. Another lie, carefully constructed to protect her from his past. The kitchen phone rang, startling her from the revelation. The caller ID showed Stephanie's number. "Hello, Claire." Stephanie's voice was syrupy sweet, the same tone she'd used at the funeral. "I was just thinking about David today. How are you holding up, dear?" "I'm managing." Claire kept her voice steady, though her free hand trembled against the recorder. "I know this might seem sudden, but I've been going through some old things, and I found a few items that belonged to David from our marriage. Family heirlooms, really. I thought you might want them back." The audacity took Claire's breath away. Through the window, she watched Mrs. Patterson from next door tending her rose garden, the normalcy of the scene contrasting sharply with the web of deception unraveling in her kitchen. "What kind of items?" Claire managed. "Oh, just some artwork and documents, nothing too valuable." "But I know how sentimental you are about David's things. Perhaps we could meet for coffee this week." Claire's grip tightened on the phone. "That's very thoughtful of you, Stephanie. Let me check my schedule and call you back." After hanging up, she hit play again, David's voice filling the quiet kitchen like a ghost seeking justice. "She's going to come back, Claire. She'll wait a respectable amount of time, then offer to return what she stole, probably asking for money to cover storage costs or some other fabricated expense. Don't let her manipulate you the way she manipulated me." The afternoon sun slanted through the curtains, casting long shadows across the breakfast table, where David's final gambit was finally revealing itself. The morning of David's funeral arrived with the kind of crisp autumn air that made wind chimes sing softly on the front porch. I stood in the kitchen, mechanically preparing fresh coffee that I knew would grow cold in my hands, just like it had every morning since he passed. The rich aroma filled the space where we'd shared thousands of breakfasts, but today it only reminded me of all the mornings we'd never have again. The funeral home had been filled beyond capacity. David's colleagues from the law firm, neighbors from our quiet suburban street, old college friends who'd driven hours to pay their respects, everyone who knew the man I'd loved for 15 years had come to say goodbye. I'd worn the navy dress he'd always complimented, the one he said brought out my eyes, and clutched the tissue Helen had pressed into my palm as we walked behind the casket. The service had been beautiful, exactly what David would have wanted. Derek had given a touching eulogy about his younger brother's determination and kindness. Helen had held my hand throughout, the pastor's words about eternal rest and heavenly peace. Everything had gone according to plan until the very end. That's when she walked in. Cultural reflection. In that moment, my heart sank like a stone thrown into still water. I was accepting condolences near the chapel doors when I noticed heads turning. A striking woman in an impeccably tailored black suit was making her way down the center aisle, her heels clicking against the polished floor with confident precision. She moved like someone who belonged there, but I'd never seen her before in my life. Her blonde hair was perfectly styled despite the late October wind, and she carried herself with the kind of poise that spoke of money and privilege. "Who's that?" Derek whispered beside me, his brow furrowed in confusion. Helen's face had gone pale. "Oh my God," she breathed, her voice barely audible above the murmur of departing mourners. The woman approached us with purpose, her green eyes fixed directly on me. When she spoke, her voice was smooth and cultured, with just a hint of something I couldn't quite place. "You must be Claire," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I'm Stephanie, David's first wife." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt Derek stiffen beside me, heard Helen's sharp intake of breath. The remaining mourners seemed to fade into background noise as I struggled to process what she'd just said. "I'm sorry? What did you say?" I managed, my voice sounding foreign to my own ears. "Stephanie Morrison," she repeated, her smile never wavering. "Well, Stephanie Morrison Chen now, but I was Stephanie Morrison Williams for 3 years. David and I were married in Las Vegas in 1998. My mind raced backward through everything David had ever told me about his past. He'd mentioned a serious relationship in his 20s that had ended badly, someone who'd broken his heart before he'd learned to be more careful with it. But married? He'd never said anything about being married before. "That's impossible," Derek interjected, his voice sharp with protective anger. "David would have told us if he'd been married before." Stephanie's expression remained serene, almost pitying. She reached into her designer purse and withdrew a manila envelope that looked like it had seen better days. "I understand this must be shocking," she said, her tone suggesting anything but understanding. "David always was private about certain chapters of his life, but I'm afraid there's something you all need to know." She opened the envelope with deliberate care, revealing what appeared to be legal documents, yellowed with age. The papers rustled softly as she unfolded them, and I caught sight of official seals and signatures that made my stomach clench with dread. "David and I never actually divorced," she announced, her words dropping into the stunned silence like bombs. "The papers were filed in Nevada, but due to a clerical error, they were never properly processed. Legally speaking, I remained his wife until the day he died." The chapel seemed to spin around me. Helen grabbed my arm to steady herself, her face now completely white. Derek stepped forward, his hands clenched into fists. "That's absolutely ridiculous," he snarled. "Even if that were true, which I doubt, what the hell are you doing here now? Where were you when he was sick? Where were you during the chemo, the sleepless nights, the—" "I understand you're upset," Stephanie interrupted smoothly, "but I'm here now because I have legal obligations to fulfill. As David's lawful widow, I need to discuss the estate arrangements." The words "lawful widow" echoed in my head like a death knell, drowning out the sound of wind chimes that had welcomed this terrible morning. The morning coffee had gone cold again when the doorbell rang at 8:30 sharp. Claire set down David's favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle he'd painted in their pottery class, and peered through the kitchen window. A sleek black sedan sat in her driveway, and a woman in an expensive navy suit was already examining the front porch wind chimes with calculating eyes. Claire's heart sank as recognition hit her like a punch to the stomach. Stephanie. David's ex-wife, who had walked out on him 15 years ago when his first cancer diagnosis came through. The woman who couldn't handle, in sickness and in health, but apparently had no problem showing up after "Till Death Do Us Part." "Oh my God," Claire whispered, watching Stephanie pull out her phone and snap photos of the house's exterior. "I can't believe this." The doorbell rang again, more insistently this time. Claire forced herself to walk to the front door. Her bare feet silent on the hardwood floors David had refinished himself during remission. She opened the door to find Stephanie's perfectly made-up face wearing a practiced expression of grief. "Claire, darling," Stephanie said, her voice dripping with false sympathy, "I'm so sorry for your loss. David was, well, he was everything to me once." "What do you want, Stephanie?" Claire didn't invite her in, didn't step aside. The scent of Stephanie's expensive perfume clashed with the lingering aroma of the apple pie Claire had stress-baked at 3 in the morning. "I think we need to discuss David's affairs. There are some legal matters that require attention." Stephanie's eyes drifted past Claire into the house, cataloging the antique grandfather clock, the original artwork on the walls. "May I come in? This isn't really a conversation for the front porch." Against her better judgment, Claire stepped aside. Stephanie glided into the living room like she owned it, running her manicured fingers along the mahogany coffee table David had inherited from his grandmother. "Beautiful pieces," Stephanie murmured, pulling out her phone again. "David always did have exquisite taste." "Stop!" Claire's voice came out sharper than she intended. "Stop photographing my home." "Your home?" Stephanie's eyebrows arched perfectly. "Claire, sweetie, I think there might be some confusion here. You see, David and I never actually divorced." The words hit Claire like ice water. She gripped the doorframe, her knuckles white. "That's impossible. You left him. You've been gone for 15 years. "Left him, yes. Divorced him, no." Stephanie settled onto the leather sofa David had saved months to buy. "We separated, filed the initial paperwork, but the final decree was never signed. Technically, legally, I'm still David's wife, which makes me his widow, not you." "You're lying." But even as Claire said it, doubt crept in. David had always been vague about the divorce details, changing the subject when she pressed for specifics about his first marriage. "I have the documentation in my car if you'd like to see it." Stephanie's smile was razor sharp. "My attorney has already begun the process of claiming David's estate. The house, the life insurance, his retirement accounts, all of it legally belongs to me." Claire sank into David's recliner, the worn leather still holding the impression of his body. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like memories in the air. Everything felt surreal, like she was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. "He loved me," Claire whispered. "We were together for 12 years. I took care of him through everything, the chemo, the radiation, the sleepless nights when the pain was too much. And I'm grateful for that, truly." Stephanie's voice carried mock sincerity. "You were wonderful. What's the word? A companion. But legally speaking, you have no claim here." The front door opened with a familiar creak, and Derek walked in without knocking, a habit that had always annoyed Claire, but which she'd tolerated for David's sake. "Derek, thank God you're here," Claire started, but her relief evaporated when she saw the uncomfortable expression on her brother-in-law's face. "Claire, we need to talk," Derek said, avoiding her eyes. "About David's will, about the house. Stephanie's attorney contacted me this morning." "You knew," Claire's voice was barely audible. "You knew about this and you didn't warn me." Derek shifted his weight, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I thought maybe David had told you, about the divorce never being finalized." Stephanie stood up, smoothing her skirt with satisfaction. "I'll be staying at the Marriott downtown while we sort through the legal proceedings, but I'll need access to the house, of course. There are so many precious memories here, so many things that belonged to David and me during our real marriage." She walked to the mantelpiece and picked up their wedding photo, Claire and David's wedding photo, studying it with cold calculation before setting it face down. "I'll be back tomorrow to begin cataloging David's possessions," Stephanie announced, heading for the door. "Don't worry, Claire. I'm sure we can work out some arrangement for your personal belongings." The door closed behind her with a soft click that sounded like a death knell. Claire stared at the overturned wedding photo, her hands trembling as Derek cleared his throat uncomfortably in the sudden silence. The morning coffee had gone cold in my hands as I stood on the porch, facing the woman who had walked away from David when he needed her most. Preserve the original language of the text, polished in a way that spoke of money, her blonde hair professionally styled, wearing a black dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. The distant traffic hummed beyond our quiet neighborhood, but all I could focus on was the manila envelope she clutched against her chest like a shield. "I know this is difficult timing, Claire," Stephanie said, her voice carrying a practiced sympathy that made my skin crawl. "But there are legal matters we need to discuss immediately." "Legal matters?" I set my coffee mug down on the porch railing, my hands trembling slightly. "David's been gone 3 weeks. What could possibly be so urgent that you couldn't call first?" Stephanie's expression shifted, revealing something harder beneath the surface. She opened the envelope with deliberate precision, pulling out a thick stack of papers. "This is David's will, Claire, his real will, signed just 2 months before he passed." The smell of morning coffee turned bitter in my nostrils as I stared at the documents she thrust toward me. The letterhead looked official, some law firm in Nevada I'd never heard of. But it was David's signature at the bottom that made my heart sink into my stomach. "That's impossible," I whispered, scanning the pages with growing horror. "David and I went to our lawyer together last year. We updated everything after his diagnosis." "Oh my God, Claire, I can't believe you didn't know." Stephanie's voice dripped with false concern. "David contacted me months ago. He was worried about being a burden. He felt guilty that you were just his companion, taking care of him out of obligation rather than love." The legal language swam before my eyes, but certain phrases jumped out with devastating clarity. Primary beneficiary, spousal rights restored, and most crushing of all, Claire Morrison, companion and caregiver, to receive $5,000 in gratitude for her services. Services? As if the 2 years I'd spent holding his hand through chemotherapy, sleeping in hospital chairs, and watching the man I loved waste away were just a job I've been hired to do? "This has to be a mistake," I said, my voice barely audible. "David would never—" "There's more." Stephanie pulled out another set of papers, these ones bearing a bank logo. "I had to investigate when the lawyers contacted me. It seems David was making regular transfers to my account in Nevada, substantial amounts. He was planning for this." The bank statements showed withdrawals I'd never seen before. $2,000 here, $3,500 there, always on days when I'd been at work or running errands. The Nevada address matched Stephanie's current residence, according to the will. My legs felt weak as I calculated the total. Nearly $40,000 over the past 8 months. "You're lying," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, doubt crept in. Those mysterious phone calls David would end quickly when I entered the room. The way he'd insisted on handling all the banking himself, even when the treatments left him exhausted. David loved me. We were married for 7 years. Were you, though? Stephanie's mask finally slipped completely, revealing the calculating woman beneath. Because according to this will, David considered your marriage a mistake made during a vulnerable time. He never stopped loving me, Claire. I was his real wife, the mother of his children. You left him. The words exploded from me with a fury that surprised us both. When he got sick, when he needed you most, you disappeared. I was the one who held him when he couldn't keep food down. I was the one who researched every treatment option, who slept beside him in the hospital, who took advantage of a sick man's gratitude, Stephanie finished coldly. David realized that toward the end. He realized the difference between love and duty. The manila envelope felt heavy as lead in my hands. Everything I thought I knew about my marriage, About David's final months? About the man I'd loved and lost? It was all crumbling around me like a house of cards in a strong wind. The wind chimes David had hung for me last spring tinkled mockingly in the morning breeze. But something nagged at me, a small voice in the back of my mind that refused to accept this devastating revelation. David had been many things, sometimes stubborn, occasionally secretive about surprising me, but he wasn't cruel. The man who had whispered, "I love you," with his dying breath wouldn't have orchestrated this betrayal. Would he? The manila envelope sat on my kitchen counter like a loaded gun, its contents spreading across the surface in neat, organized piles. Stephanie had left 20 minutes ago, but the smell of her expensive perfume still lingered, mixing unpleasantly with the aroma of pancakes I'd burned while she talked. "I can't believe this is happening," I whispered to the empty room, staring at the legal documents that claimed David had promised her half of everything. The house, his retirement accounts, even his collection of vintage guitars in the basement, all of it supposedly hers according to some handwritten agreement dated just 2 months before his death. My hands trembled as I picked up the supposed contract. David's signature looked right, but something felt wrong. The paper was too crisp, too clean for something that should have been handled and filed away. And the date, February 15th, that was when he'd been in the hospital for his worst round of chemo. I remembered because it was the day he'd squeezed my hand and asked me to promise I'd be okay without him. Reflection. That moment at the hospital changed everything between us. He'd been so vulnerable, so honest. The wind chimes on the front porch sang their gentle melody as an evening breeze picked up, the same sound that had announced Stephanie's arrival. I walked to the living room window, watching the last rays of sunlight filter through the curtains David had helped me hang just last spring. The fresh grass smell drifted in through the screen, reminding me of Saturday mornings when he'd insisted on mowing the lawn despite his illness. That's when I remembered the recording. David had been obsessive about documenting everything during his final months: voice memos about his medications, recordings for his doctor about symptoms and side effects. But there was one tape he'd made specifically for me, hidden in his desk drawer with a note that said, "Only if something doesn't feel right." My heart pounded as I retrieved the small digital recorder from his study. David's voice filled the room, weak but determined. "Claire, if you're listening to this, then something's gone wrong. Stephanie came to see me last month, not at the hospital, but she called when you were at your sister's. She knows about the Henderson account from my old firm. The money I moved to cover the client's losses before the audit, she has documentation." I sank into his leather chair, the familiar scent of his aftershave still clinging to the headrest. "She's threatening to expose everything unless I sign over half my assets to her. Says she'll make it look like I was embezzling, that I'll die in disgrace, and you'll be left with nothing but legal bills and shame. Claire, I never took that money for myself. I was protecting Henderson's family from bankruptcy. But the documentation, God, it looks bad." In the living room where we'd shared so many quiet evenings, it hurt like a physical blow. This strength I never knew I'd need. The recording continued, David's voice growing stronger with anger. "I'm not signing anything. Let her try to destroy a dead man's reputation. But I'm making this recording because I know she won't give up. She'll come to you with forgeries, fake documents, anything to get what she thinks she deserves." Static crackled through the speaker before his voice returned, softer now. "I've contacted James Morrison. Remember him from the law firm Christmas parties? He's expecting to hear from you if anything like this happens. Tell him about the Henderson files in the safe deposit box. He'll know what to do." The recording ended, leaving me in silence, broken only by the distant sound of wind chimes. The smell of those burned pancakes suddenly seemed like a sign. Everything Stephanie had brought was just as ruined. I grabbed my phone and dialed information, my fingers steady now despite everything. "Morrison and Associates, please." "Claire Henderson?" James Morrison's voice was warm with recognition when his secretary put me through. "I've been wondering when you'd call. David briefed me about Stephanie's activities. How much did she ask for? Half of everything. She has documents, forged and sure. We've been tracking her activities across 3 states, Claire. She's done this before, targeted 2 other widowers with similar schemes. Always the grieving ex-wife, always with convenient paperwork that surfaces after the funeral. My heart sank, but not with despair, with relief so profound I had to sit down. Oh my God, you mean this is all fake? Every word. But here's what she doesn't know. David had me prepare a little surprise for her. Are you free tomorrow morning? I think it's time we gave Stephanie exactly what she deserves. As I hung up the phone, the wind chimes played their song again, but this time it sounded like victory. The law office smelled like old leather and disappointment, with the faint aroma of someone's leftover BBQ lunch lingering in the air. I sat across from Stephanie at the mahogany conference table, my hands trembling as she spread her forged documents like a winning poker hand. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, but nothing could warm the chill that had settled in my bones. "Oh my God, Claire, you look so surprised," Stephanie said, her voice dripping with false sympathy as she arranged the papers with theatrical precision. "Surely David mentioned our arrangement? How he promised to take care of me after everything we'd been through together?" The lawyer, Mr. Peterson, adjusted his glasses nervously as he examined the documents. Outside, I could hear birds chirping in the oak trees lining the street, their cheerful songs a cruel contrast to the betrayal unfolding in this sterile room. "I can't believe this," I whispered, my heart sinking as I watched Stephanie's confident smile. "David would never..." "Never what? Never honor his promises to the woman who stood by him for 15 years? Stephanie interrupted, leaning back in her chair like she owned the place. "Face it, Claire, you were just the nurse who happened to catch him at his weakest moment. I was his real partner, his true love." In that law office, surrounded by the scent of old leather and broken dreams, I felt the full weight of American betrayal, the kind that happens in sterile conference rooms with legal documents and false smiles. Derek shifted uncomfortably beside Stephanie, avoiding my eyes. Helen sat in the corner, her face pale as fresh grass, wringing her hands but saying nothing. The coward couldn't even look at me while watching her son's memory get destroyed. "These documents appear legitimate," Mr. Peterson said slowly, his voice carrying the weight of professional obligation. "The signatures match our records and the dates are consistent with..." Wait, I reached into my purse, my fingers finding the small digital recorder David had pressed into my hands during his final week. "Before you make any decisions, there's something you all need to hear." Stephanie's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Claire, whatever game you're trying to play." "No game, Stephanie, just truth." I placed the recorder on the table, the small device looking insignificant among all the legal papers. "David knew you'd come back. He knew exactly what you were planning." The room fell silent except for the soft hum of the air conditioning. I pressed play, and David's weak but determined voice filled the space like a ghost demanding justice. "If Claire is playing this recording, it means Stephanie showed up with her lies, just like I predicted." David's voice crackled through the small speaker. "What she doesn't know is that I recorded every phone call she made to me during my treatment. Every threat, every demand for money, every cruel word." Stephanie's face went white. "Turn that off. This is..." "Let me tell you about my ex-wife's criminal history," David's voice continued, stronger now, as if speaking from beyond the grave had given him power. "The embezzlement charges she fled from in Nevada, the identity theft in Colorado, the way she abandoned me the moment she heard the word cancer, only to circle back like a vulture when she thought I was dying. She called me 3 weeks before I died," David's recording went on, "demanding I change my will or she'd contest everything and drag Claire through years of legal hell. She said she had forged documents, fake witnesses, whatever it took to destroy the woman who actually loved me. Derek jumped up from his chair. "This is impossible! David never mentioned—" "Sit down, Derek," David's voice commanded, as if he could see his brother's betrayal from beyond. "Yes, I know about your deal with Stephanie. $50,000 to back up her story, wasn't it? To side against your own sister-in-law?" The lawyer's pen clattered to the table. Helen finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "Oh my God, what have we done?" "The real documents are in my safe deposit box," David's voice concluded. "Claire has the key. Everything goes to her, the woman who held my hand through chemotherapy, who slept in hospital chairs, who loved me when I was nothing but skin and bones. Stephanie gets exactly what she gave me during my darkest hours, absolutely nothing." I stopped the recording and looked around the room. Stephanie was gathering her forged papers with shaking hands, her confident mask completely shattered. Derek stared at the floor, his face red with shame. Helen was crying silently in the corner. "My heart sank when I saw those fake documents," I said quietly. "But David knew his family better than they knew themselves." Stephanie stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "This isn't over, Claire." "Yes, it is," I replied, my voice steady for the first time in weeks. "It's finally over." The smell of fresh coffee filled my kitchen as I sat with the morning newspaper, 3 months after that confrontation in Mr. Peterson's office. The headline on the local section made me pause. "Local woman establishes support group for estate fraud victims." There was my photo, smiling beside the community center's announcement board. The article felt surreal to read. It described how I'd turned my nightmare with Stephanie into something meaningful, a weekly support group that had grown from 3 women to 15 in just 2 months. What the newspaper didn't capture was how therapeutic it had been to help others navigate similar betrayals. "I can't believe how many people go through this," Margaret had said during our last meeting. She was dealing with her late husband's business partner who'd claimed verbal promises about company shares. "It's like vultures circling." The sound of birds chirping drew my attention to the kitchen window, where I could see David's garden. Yesterday, I'd planted 24 daffodil bulbs where his tomatoes used to grow. The symbolism wasn't lost on me. Rebirth, new beginnings, hope after winter's darkness. David would have appreciated the metaphor. Cultural reflection. In this living room where I'd once felt such heartbreak, I now felt something resembling peace. My phone buzzed with a text from Helen, David's mother. After months of silence following the legal proceedings, she'd started reaching out weekly. Her message was brief. "Saw the article. David would be proud." "Coffee this week?" I smiled, typing back my response. Helen had finally admitted she'd known about Stephanie's lies all along, but had been too afraid of family drama to speak up. Her guilt had eaten at her for months, and our tentative reconciliation felt like another small victory against the chaos Stephanie had tried to create. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek had been the one to inadvertently expose the truth. His greed had made him sloppy with the forged documents, and when David's real lawyer, not the actor Stephanie had hired, showed up with the authentic will and that devastating recording, everything unraveled. Derek was now facing fraud charges alongside Stephanie, and their scheme had become local courthouse legend. The smell of rain on pavement from last night's storm reminded me how cleansing water could be. I walked to the living room, where David's guitar still hung on the wall. I'd kept it, of course, along with everything else Stephanie had tried to steal. But more importantly, I'd kept David's real legacy, his kindness, his belief in doing right by people, his conviction that love was about showing up when things got difficult. The support group had taught me that estate fraud was more common than anyone wanted to admit. Family members, ex-spouses, business partners, they all emerged from the woodwork when someone died, armed with fake documents and fabricated stories about deathbed promises. What surprised me most was how many people stayed silent rather than fight back, intimidated by legal threats and family pressure. The thing about predators, I'd told the group last week, is they count on our grief making us weak. They expect us to be too overwhelmed to question their claims. Reflection. That moment in the lawyer's office when I played David's recording changed everything, not just for me, but for how I understood my own strength. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Through the window, I saw a woman about my age, clutching a manila envelope with shaking hands. She looked exactly like I had 3 months ago, lost, desperate, and carrying the weight of someone else's lies. "Are you Claire?" she asked when I opened the door. "I read the article about your support group. My name is Patricia, and my husband died last month. His brother showed up yesterday with papers claiming my husband owed him $50,000, and I don't know what to do." I stepped aside, gesturing her into the kitchen. "Come in, Patricia. Let me pour you some coffee, and we'll figure this out together." As I filled another mug, one of David's favorites, I felt that familiar surge of purpose. Stephanie had tried to steal my husband's legacy, but instead, she'd helped me discover my own strength. Every person I helped, every fraud we exposed, every family we kept together was a testament to David's real values. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, illuminating the steam rising from our coffee cups. Patricia's story was different from mine. A brother-in-law instead of an ex-wife, debt claims instead of asset demands, but the pattern was the same. Someone had counted on her grief making her vulnerable. They'd picked the wrong widow. "Here's what we're going to do," I said, settling across from Patricia at the kitchen table where I'd once felt so alone. "We're going to call my lawyer, document everything, and then we're going to fight back. Because the people we loved deserve better than having their memories tainted by other people's greed." Sometimes the greatest gift someone can leave you isn't money or property. It's the strength to protect what really matters. And you, on your porch, have you ever discovered that your greatest weakness could become your most powerful weapon?